Hello and welcome to NewsClick. We have with us today Professor Hans Hock, who's a very well-known scholar of Sanskrit, spent a lot of time in India and has also researched a lot of issues which are of concern to all of us. Professor Hock, good to have you with us.
Thank you.
One of the major issues which always comes up in Indian history is the issue, of course, of the Indian Aryan Invasion, and also the thesis that all Indian languages, including Dravidian, really originate from Sanskrit. So what would you comment based on current evidence and other sources?
Well, let me begin with the term Aryan Invasion. Like much of the debate, it is so 19th century. It reeks of the whole idea of nations invading other nations, subjugating them and all that kind of thing, which is a fairly recent development in human history, actually. Even the British, when they first came to India, came as traders. They kind of slithered into empire, almost, with a lot of false steps along the way and some very clever ones too. So the point is that to back project 19th century ideology of Western colonial empires onto prehistory somewhere maybe in the second millennium BC seems to be totally anachronistic. So that's a major problem. I mean, and so it's not something, that image is not something which people in prehistory, archaeology, linguistics would employ nowadays.
But somebody says that trees have roots, but people have feet.
Yeah. Now, one thing is, we would say basically that the speakers of Indo-Aryan, and there's a difference between saying that and saying Aryan, that they came presumably to South Asia or India from the outside. And they did so not through some invasion, but through some kind of set of migrations, presumably. From all we can tell, they came as pastoralists. And among pastoralists, you have this kind of cycle that they stay in different areas at different seasons. And sometimes they go into a neighboring area and find that maybe fodder is better there for their animals. And so they migrate, but they don't migrate in very swift movements necessarily. They migrate very slowly. They're also not as often portrayed nomads. They're somewhere in between sedentary and purely nomadic. So these are some things which I think historians and anthropologists, archaeologists would agree would be the appropriate way of characterizing whatever may have taken place at that time. The other problem which you face too is this identification of language and ethnicity. If you look at India, there is a common classification of languages and their speakers in terms of so-called civilized and so-called tribal languages, or literate and tribal. Now, that doesn't correspond to any linguistic division, but rather you have Indo-Aryan and Dravidian literate societies, and you have Indo-Aryan, Munda, Dravidian, Tibeto-Burman, and a number of other tribal societies. So there is no one-to-one correspondence in that sense between civilization, of however we might define this, and language.
Or ethnicity and languages.
And of course that's true, right? So the point here is that simply we have to get rid of many of these concepts in order to address that issue. Now, as you said, languages do require some movement to distribute over a larger area, at least before the advent of electronic media. So what needs to be explained, and it's a perfectly legitimate question no matter what your perception might be otherwise, how do we account for the fact that there are speakers of Indo-Aryan languages in India, South Asia, and they are linguistically related, or their languages are linguistically related to that of speakers in Europe, Armenia, in Iran, So how do we account for that? Somebody presumably had to move. The question is who moved, where from, why, when? The typical WH questions which a journalist would have to ask. And so the question is, can we find an answer to that? And it turns out that many of the ideas which were there traditionally in 19th century perspectives were really quite hasty. And the issue is much more difficult to figure out. I'm always amazed by people who, on one side or another, have this very clear view that they know the truth. I think we have to take this basically as a scientific issue where we have to judge what is the best hypothesis. And that doesn't mean that it's the absolute truth, because we can't go back in time. All we can do is think of explanations for what we can observe, and then choose the explanation which gives the best account.
Recently, of course, genetics has added to tracing out immigration patterns. And it's quite interesting to see a lot of the evidence seems to point to what historical linguistics in an earlier era had sketched out as possible immigration patterns. Of course, not always, but a lot of it seems to be actually falling very close to what was held to be the common historical linguistic view.
That turns out to be problematic, actually. There were some early genomic studies which addressed, again, the question of the Aryan movement, let us call it. And they seemed to reach the conclusion that there was evidence for movement, at least within South Asia, to the south. But that can be explained in other ways, because we know that when the Dravidian kingdoms start coming up in the south, northern Brahmins and Buddhist monks came down there to do administration, and the Brahmins also to perform the ceremonies which legitimized the kings, especially in the eyes of their northern counterparts. So that will account for much of what was observed within South Asia. On the outside, there's a problem that people have pointed out in archaeology for quite some time, that during the entire last 5,000 years, at least, there has been no appreciable change in the skeletal mixture in the northwest. It's just the area where people normally come into South Asia. And that's a bit of a problem, and it has been used then by people who try to deny the so-called Aryan Invasion theory as an indication that this must be a hoax because there is no evidence. True, but the point is, of course, first of all, there is no evidence for any out-migration either. You have a choice. Either you have people moving in, or you have people moving out in order to account for the widespread of these languages. So there is no evidence one way or the other. This is often ignored in this context. Secondly, what's also important is that let's just set aside the question of the so-called Aryans. We know in historical times all kinds of groups came to South Asia from that northern area. And what happened there? They left no evidence in the skeletal mix. So evidently, the assumption which is underlying this, which was there among many of the dirt anthropologists and so forth too, that movement of people and languages and cultures requires an appreciable change in skeletal mix, in genetic mix. This assumption is simply wrong.
What you're saying is the numbers for a language to travel could be small.
Yes.
And it could still actually show itself as a dominant language.
This is what people have called elite dominance. And so there have been more recent genomic studies which gives very strong evidence that whatever, except for the northeast, whatever mixture there is of genome and other traits in South Asia has been that way for the last 20 to 40,000 years. There's also some indication that actually there was a migration out of the greater South Asian area, you might say, through Central Asia and then into Europe.
That's all for this part of the interview. We'll come back for the second part in the next session. Thank you.